Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/ShelbyForsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hi there, grief growers, and thank you so much for joining me for another week of Grief Book Roundup. This week, I would love to bring you the book Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. I had wanted to read this book for a long time and had the joy of picking it up, even though it's not a very old book, it's relatively recent, at a local used bookstore. So this is a shout out to all the local used bookstores that exist in the world, and also a reminder that grief books are not things that always need to be bought new. They are things that can be found at used bookstores, at your local library. If you have access to little free libraries in the country where you live, they're really wonderful places to find, sometimes even surprisingly, grief books. So in Being Mortal, practicing surgeon and Harvard Med professor Dr. Atul Gawande asks a lot of big, important questions we as individuals have about our deaths, while also studying and critiquing the larger systems and structures in which we currently die. So it covers death and mortality, especially in the medical system, from an individual level, how do we experience it, but also from a societal level, how do we experience it? Through a series of stories, conversations, interviews, literary tie-ins, and statistics, Dr. Gawande shares an intimate portrait of what has become of westernized medicine and how human beings prioritize what matters at the end of their lives. I will submit just one note of caution here, that this book does contain graphic descriptions of surgical procedures and bodies breaking down through sickness and injury on their way to death. While reading it, I appreciated the fact that Dr. Gawande did not use euphemisms to describe what was happening to people, but if you are sensitive to end-of-life mental imagery at this time in your grief, it might be good to save this book for another season of your life. If I had to pick 3 words to describe Being Mortal, they would be comprehensive, poignant, and meaningful. Comprehensive because being mortal runs the full gamut, not just from what we'll experience individually through the medical system as people who are eventually dying, but the research that Atul Gawande does, it spans medicine, it spans psychology, and there's actually a bit in here too about spirituality and meaning making. What meaning do we make of our lives as we are on our way to dying? And there's a comprehensiveness in that a lot of other books about the medical system of death and dying in the United States and in westernized society does not get into. Poignant because this is not a dry book. I opened Being Mortal with the expectation that I would be met with a lot of statistics and a lot of larger kind of bird's eye view information, but no, Atul Gawande goes into sharing stories from his patients, from people who are in nursing and nursing homes and healthcare and surgery, and how they talk about and deal with death. And so each chapter is riddled with these personal, beautiful stories and heartbreaking stories of what happens to people as they are dying within the systems and structures that we have set in place in westernized society. And meaningful because, of course, we will all die. And so there is a lot of room, a lot of space for us to contemplate what that means, what we want to happen, what we want that to look like, and ultimately what matters. Is it truly being able to work? Is it truly being able to make money? Is it truly our family and friends? Is it truly being able to walk or to travel or to bathe ourselves? What really matters as we are inching closer to our deaths? And Atul Gawande really asks these questions alongside examining the systems and structures in which we die. For losses included in the book, death is the biggest loss, of course, covered in Being Mortal, but I was surprised to read about 3/4 of the way through this book about the death of Dr. Gawande's own father, also Dr. Gawande. Throughout the book, Atul Gawande highlights the stories of his own patients as well as others who have approached end of life, but he really brought it as close to home as possible by choosing to include his family's experience with palliative care and his father's priorities and meaning making at the end of his life. And Atul Gawande really does a masterful job of combining his own experience with the larger picture of death-centric medical care in Being Mortal. Also in this book, you will find the grief of living in a society that is death avoidant, the grief of the power struggle between those who are physically and mentally able and those who are disabled by illness or aging, the grief of not being able to make decisions for yourself, especially as it regards to end of life, the grief of the harm of inaccurate predictions by medical staff. I'm calling this the grief of faux optimism, telling people they will live longer than they actually will, and the grief of isolation, especially as it relates to the nursing home industry. Some favorite quotes from the book, ones that really sum up what's happening in the all of Being Mortal, is first this one from page 140. Whatever the time limits and travails we face, we want to retain the autonomy, the freedom to be the authors of our lives. And this comes from a chapter where Atul Gawande is talking a great deal about what matters to people at the end is not being able to do great things, not even to work, not even oftentimes to leave a legacy, but to retain things like freedom and independence and decision-making. My next favorite quote comes from page 232, and it reads, "At least two kinds of courage are required in aging and sickness. The first is the courage to confront the reality of mortality, the courage to seek out the truth of what is to be feared and what is to be hoped. Such courage is difficult enough. We have many reasons to shrink away from it. But even more daunting is the second kind of courage, the courage to act on the truth we find." And this is something that Dr. Gawande covers in so much of Being Mortal, is we have a lot of reasons to be afraid of death, and we are ultimately still a death-averse society. So the first thing that is required of us is to actually seek out what it means to die and to look at that face to face. But the second kind of courage that we need is the courage to actually do something with that information. It is one thing to feel and to have the experience of a thing, as so many of us know in grief, and it is quite another to apply that information and that wisdom and that knowledge to the action of living your life. So especially if you are a grief care professional, a death care professional, a medical professional, or simply someone who is dying, as we all are, I highly, highly recommend that you pick up and read Being Mortal. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.